spent a bit of time on him because he's been very important, obviously to me personally, intellectually, but also I think to the greater left. And that's Arno Mayer, somebody who if you listen to us, you've heard us bring up many times before. Arno Mayer died, I think, about 10 days ago. He had been a professor at Princeton and really one of the more influential. I think he wasn't really generally associated with the New Left per se, people like Lefebvre and Gardner and Kolko and them. He was never really, but he actually was definitely a part of that. He was a European diplomatic historian, and he was Jewish, which is important, as we'll see in a moment. Mayer wrote two amazing books about World War I, the political origins of the new diplomacy, and the politics of diplomacy and peacemaking, which is about the conference at Versailles. And what he did was move away from the kind of typical way people studied European politics at that time and put a huge focus on domestic politics. So he talked about labor and he talked about the origins of socialist parties throughout Europe. And the famous configuration, which I use all the time, I've used it in my writing, I've used it on here. So he devised this idea that the war during World War I and even after was a contest between what he called the forces of movement and the forces of order. Now, the forces of order would be the old regime. And he also wrote another book called The Persistence of the Old Regime, which I think is really relevant too. We'll get to that in a moment. But the forces of order would be the old regime, the people who have traditionally been in power. Now, at the time he's writing about, we're talking about kind of the landed elite of Europe. This is in the earlier period of industrialization. Clearly, there's an industrial elite, but you also have this kind of older bourgeois landed elite too. And then you have the force of movement, which is the left, right? And these are socialist parties, these are labor unions, and this is happening all over in both Europe and in the United States. And kind of one of the themes, and you get that also in the persistence of the old regime, is that the forces of movement, people like us, right, often take the initiative. We kind of storm the Bastille and we attack these older entrenched forces. And they may go reeling, they may reel from it, right? But they persist, they rebound, they figure out new ways to organize society. In World War I, one of the key things they did was convince the working classes to take this kind of nationalist approach to the war from 1914 onward, rather than solidify and organize collectively as a working class against the war, right? And this is something that we've talked about ever since, right? He also, in the second book he wrote, Politics, Diplomacy, and Peacemaking, which I think is really critically important, he puts the need by the West, what they saw as a need to contain the Soviet Union at the forefront of the post-war order and at Versailles. So what was going on there? Clearly Germany was a major force, right? You have to figure out what to do to Germany. But at the end of the day, they figured Germany is going to be in full. Germany is an old capitalist country, right? But the Soviet Union terrified the Western leaders, right? They had come in, the world had never seen cats like this before, right? They were nationalizing banks and shutting down the media and shutting down the churches. They had never seen anything like that. And at Versailles, you see a concentrated effort. The Bolsheviks were not even at Versailles. They were just denied entry there. They weren't even allowed to be there. And essentially, the Cold War began in that period. And that whole conception of the forces of movement, the force of order, the containment of the left. And I also think this is really prevalent in the work of somebody who's had a huge influence on me, is Gabriel Kolko, who I think writes in similar ways. And I think for that alone, Arno Mayer is legendary. I think what he's done is simply amazing. He also configures World War I and World War II as a long war, right? He connects them together, which is obviously you have to, right? Because the emergence of Hitler, the global economic depression of the 20s, and the emergence of National Socialism in Europe clearly emerges from the disastrous decisions made at Versailles. He was an unabashed leftist, a Marxist. In grad school, I actually have a field in European military history. It was funny. One of my professors there hated Arno Mayer. The conservatives hated him. Every time I mentioned a book by Arno Mayer, he would just look at me with scorn. But I think he really rocked the cradle. He rocked the boat. He actually capsized the boat. In 1988, he wrote a book called Why Did the Heavens Not Darken?, which was a historical analysis of anti-Jewish actions. And he did not use the word Holocaust. And in it, he pointed out that historically, there's a background there, which I think is important about historically how Europeans have always attacked Jews. So you have this history of pogroms and all kinds of oppressions, the Merchant of Venice, 1598, right? So there's this longstanding thing going on there. But the meat of it is about the World War II era. And what he did there really blew up and pissed off a lot of people. He argued that World War II really wasn't about the Holocaust, that in fact, Hitler's kind of overall program wasn't really centered on anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic ideas. In fact, he said that Hitler's main goal, and I think other left historians brought this up, was actually the Soviet Union. And that's if you read his Hitler's earlier ideological works, clearly he talks about confidence. He talks about Jews, right? But he also talks about Bolsheviks a lot. They're the same to him, right? Because so much of the early Bolshevik movement was Jewish, right? And so what Arno Mayer argued, why the heavens not darken, was that once Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and makes quick progress, but by December it's really badly bogged down. By 1942, the Red Army is reversing the Wehrmacht. And he argues that's really when Hitler kind of consolidated and finally articulated the full spectrum of the Holocaust. And this is when the trainings and the death camps and all that commenced, not prior to that. So the idea that World War II was about the Holocaust is clearly one of the most morally revulsive things going on in the history of the world, like Gaza today. But that wasn't the point of it. Hitler's war was against the Soviets, not the Jews. And he realized by 1942 that the war in the East wasn't turning out well. He said, and this is Arno Mayer, anti-Semitism did not play a decisive or even significant role in the growth of the Nazi movement and electorate. The appeals of Nazism were many and complex. People rallied to a syncretic creed of ultranationalism, social Darwinism, anti-Marxism, anti-Bolshevism, and anti-Semitism, as well as to a party program calling for a revision of Versailles, the repeal of reparations, the curb of industrial capitalism, and the establishment of a Volkish welfare state. That says a lot there. It was a huge, I think, contribution, an eruption really in the field of Jewish studies, in the field of Holocaust studies. I've never read anything that like Finkelstein has said about this, but I've got to believe that he's sympathetic to it, right? But it's really just an incredible book. He caught so much flack for this. I just remember the reviews going back and forth, the arguments going back and forth. He was just getting flooded with venom. If there had been social media back then, oh my God, I can only imagine he would have been trolled and threatened and God knows,
Canceled, like threatened with
canceled.
cancel.
Oh yeah, he's anti-Semitic, right? And then, and I think that also all the stuff he does segues, I think, very well into what we're talking about today, right? Because we've seen this configuration, the forces of movement, the force of order. Really, I think just pretty much any conflict, I think you can look at it that way, right? You have these various movements which are dealing with issues. It could be the environment, it could be labor, it could be women's rights, it could be reproductive, who knows what. But then you also have the state being involved in these kind of imperial and militaristic adventures, which often distract us and tear us apart. And we've spoken many times about how, just on a personal level, we were doing some really cool anti-globalization work, and then 9/11 happened, and then the invasion of Afghanistan, and then obviously the invasion of Iraq, and how that kind of really screwed everything up because it forced people to choose, and many people who were otherwise maybe liberal or left took a more nationalist approach to it. And we've seen that time and again. In 2008, he wrote a book called Plowshares into Swords. It is anti-Zionist, it is pro-Palestinian. And I think, again, it gets to that point where a lot of people want to attribute particular behaviors to religion, anti-Semitism, clash of civilizations, Islamophobia, whatever it may be. And I think what Mayer's contribution, and he has many, but one of the biggest ones, is that you need to look behind that, right? The description of the Nazi appeal, I think, is really crucial because I've been saying that about Trump. A lot of people have been saying that about Trump, right? Where he said the Nazi supporters rallied to a syncretic creed of ultranationalism, social Darwinism, anti-Marxism, anti-Bolshevism, anti-Semitism, revision of Versailles, repeal of reparations, curb of industrial capitalism, and the establishment of a Volkish welfare state, right? And I think in the same way that people would attribute anti-Semitism to Hitler's motivation, in the US, liberals, I think, overwhelmingly still attribute things like racism and anti-immigrant ideas to Trump. Those exist. You'd be foolish to suggest that they don't. but there's a lot more to it than that. I think a lot of Trump supporters, much like these supporters of the Nazis, and I don't, that's a glib, I think, comparison. I'm not trying to, I think the whole kind of Trump is a fascist and Trump is a Nazi. It's very troubling historically, but I think there is a similarity in that these people really are looking for a kind of a romantic past, right? And they really don't like the world, and they're pissed off at elites like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and John Fetterman and you
But
name it.
and but their theme is "Make America Great Again," so they're definitely embracing that romantic history, which didn't ever really exist, and then
It's
blame these liberal elites, mostly on the coasts,
yeah. They're
for their state, for the
well,
current state of
I actually
affairs.
blame the liberal elites on the coast too. So got to admit, I
Yeah,
agree with them on
we're not unsympathetic.
that. Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi, my Christmas card list. But there's a great article written long ago by a historian named Hold Your Hair Away called Clio Deceived. Clio is the Muse of History, which talked about the way intellectuals and historians really collaborated in this effort to rehabilitate Germany after the First War, right? It wasn't our fault and we should be great again. Remember, that was what Hitler was talking about, was a greater Germany, right? It's not our fault. We should be great again. And these elites sold us out, and obviously Jewish elites was a big part of that in their ideology. But they always had a focus on the left, which is why until Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, whatever, it doesn't matter. But until then, the West was wary of him, but never alarmed because he was acting like European imperialist act, right? No one in Europe was pro-Jewish. There had been a long history, and that's what Arno Mayer's point is, right? There's this long history of attacks on Jews, of pogroms, of repression, of discrimination. And so Hitler doesn't come up with that, and it's not new in the 1930s. And so it's a lot more complex than that. So Arno Mayer, I think today is as relevant as he's been. We'll put some stuff in the show notes. I wrote an article which kind of tees off on some of his stuff, right? But anytime something happens, I immediately in my mind think of forces of movement, forces of order. I may not be the smartest guy in the world, but I'm pretty well educated and I've learned a lot and I've been instructed by some really great people. I never knew Arno Mayer, unfortunately, but a lot of people I knew told me, read Arno Mayer. And then we talked about it. And so a good deal of my intellectual development, my maturation, and success, I think, actually, is because I'm really familiar with what he did. Politics and diplomacy of peacemaking, the political origins of the new diplomacy, why did the heavens not darken, the persistence of the old regime, and plowshares into swords, just as a start. So that's your assignment. I want all those read by the end of January.
We'll include them in the show notes
We'll include
for
them in the
those
show
of you
notes.
who like syllabi.
But Arno